Ready?
Yep.
All right.
This is a magnet, and this is sand. Oh, it's fuzzy. It's fuzzy sand. It's so cool. It's so cool. I made it, y'all. Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me on my epic jaunt across New Zealand. I spent about 3 weeks exploring the entire country of New Zealand. I started off on South Island, made my way up to North Island, and it was now time for my last destination of Auckland. At the end of our Hobbiton, Rotorua, and Waitomo Glowworm Caves day tour, our guide drove us up to Auckland. The other people in the tour had originated from Auckland, so they were returning to Auckland, whereas I had started out in Rotorua that morning, so for me, I was just arriving in Auckland for the first time. I arrived at my hotel on the Prince Wharf at about 7 at night, ordered some room service, and then crashed, exhausted after a very fun and interesting day. Bright and early on the morning of my first full day in Auckland, I was picked up by Bush and Beach Tours for an Auckland City Sights tour. They drove us around the Auckland Central Business District and showed us some of the historical buildings and sites, including the Auckland War Memorial Museum, which I will return to later. And then we headed over to Devonsport to enjoy some ice cream and take in the view of the Auckland skyline. Auckland is the largest city in New Zealand and is often referred to as the city of sails due to its large maritime culture and history. Auckland was at one time the capital of New Zealand until the capital was moved to Wellington in 1865. Auckland is much larger and more crowded than the other cities and towns I'd visited across New Zealand. Several people had told me not to spend a whole lot of time in Auckland because it is just another big city, and I kind of agree with them. Auckland just has a different vibe from it and doesn't feel quite as uniquely New Zealandish as other cities like Wellington or towns like Queenstown. At the end of my city highlights tour, I headed back to the Auckland War Memorial Museum for a museum highlights tour. The Auckland War Memorial Museum was built in 1929 to honor the memory of the Aucklanders who lost their lives during World War I. The third floor of the building is dedicated just to the World War I memorial, and there are other memorials to the Second World War and other wars that New Zealand has participated in. On the third floor, my guide showed me the Roll of Honor, which lists the names of all the servicemen and women from the Auckland province who lost their lives during the First World War. Other towns and cities across New Zealand have similar memorials to the men and women from their own regions who were lost in battle as well. And I saw several of these at different points across my trip. My guide then showed me the World War I Sanctuary, which is a room off to the side that houses a bronze wreath of kawakawa leaves, which represent mourning, as well as the Maori inscription Kia Mate Toa, which means be strong in death. Across from the World War I Sanctuary is the incredible stained glass ceiling, which bears the coat of arms for all of the British dominions and colonies at the time of the First World War. Some of these countries are no longer under the dominion or colonization of the British. You have the Channel Islands, Fiji, Jamaica, and Malta on the north wall, Gibraltar, Kenya, South Africa, and Newfoundland on the east wall, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, and Australia on the south wall, India, Ceylon, Malaya, and the Strait Settlement on the west wall. These coats of arms are a little outdated. Ceylon is now Sri Lanka, and Malaya is now part of Singapore. Today, the Auckland War Memorial Museum also houses an extensive collection of artifacts from across the Polynesian Triangle, including Tonga, Samoa, and Tahiti. I'm gonna have to do a whole video just on the Polynesian Triangle because it's really fascinating. I started learning about the Polynesian Triangle on my trip to Tahiti and French Polynesia, and I'm learning a lot more about it as I've traveled across New Zealand, and it's heavily influencing my next adventure. So stay tuned for that. They also have an earthquake replicator. They have you enter this room that's set up to replicate what it feels like to experience an earthquake or a tsunami. People who have actually experienced earthquakes say it's not exactly realistic, but I thought it was a really interesting experience nonetheless. The whole room shakes and the furniture rattles and you hear the crashing and the rumbling and everything. It's kind of intense. I hope to never experience an actual earthquake, but this was a pretty interesting experience for me. At the time of my visit, the Auckland War Memorial Museum had a traveling exhibit about ancient Egypt, so I figured, what the heck, when in New Zealand, and I paid a visit to that as well. The exhibit had artwork and artifacts from the various dynasties of ancient Egypt, including replicas of the inside of a pyramid and a 3D model of an actual mummy, so that we could see how the body was carefully wrapped in these cloths without actually having to dismantle anything. And that was really cool. By now, the Auckland War Memorial Museum was getting ready to close, so I headed back down the hill toward my hotel. On the way, I paid a quick visit to the Auckland Botanical Gardens and the Auckland Fernery. After being in New Zealand for nearly 3 weeks, I had accumulated some extra stuff. Please don't judge me. To the point where the Flexi Tours tour guide had actually been complaining about how much luggage I had. And I knew I was going to have to start consolidating that down and packing it into flight-worthy luggage, and I finally came to the conclusion that I was just going to have to buy another bag. So I spent the evening of my first full day in Auckland wandering around the Auckland Central Business District looking for a place that sold affordable luggage, which was surprisingly hard. I found several shops that were kind of similar to REI or Summit Hut, but their luggage was like $100 to $200, and I really didn't want to have to shovel out that much money just to fly some of my stuff home. I eventually found a little kiosk in a mall that had a sale on suitcases, and I let the very friendly salesperson talk me into buying my very first hard shell suitcase. After the conversion rate, it wasn't terribly expensive, so I figured I just need the thing to be able to get me home. But let me tell you, that little suitcase survived a 40-minute walk along bumpy sidewalks, across streets, dodging buses, and still survived the flight home. I was so surprised by the durability of this cheap little suitcase that I bought at the mall kiosk that I'm actually considering taking it on with me on my next adventure. Say hi, Mr. Ziki. Now, in all the time I've been in New Zealand, I hadn't yet had the chance to have a proper British high tea. So on the morning of my last full day in New Zealand, I booked high tea at the Bluebell Cakery. Bluebell Cakery has several locations around Auckland. The location that I went to was about a 10-minute walk from my hotel. It was fairly small. It only had a handful of tables, but a large display of various cakes and other pastries. They had a table reserved for me in the corner. They gave me a menu to select my tea, and then brought out the classic 3-tier high tea tray with a variety of little hand sandwiches and pastries and scones with jam and clotted cream. Overall, it was a really fun experience. If you're looking to do a high tea experience in Auckland, I would definitely look into doing it at the Bluebell Cakery. That afternoon, I was picked up by Bush and Beach Tours again for a hiking trip on Auckland's west coast. Usually the tour visits Piha Beach, but due to road damage caused by the hurricanes and storms earlier that year, we had to visit Cornwallis Beach instead. The North Island has an abundance of titanamagnetite magnetic black sand, and someone had brought a magnet so that we could play with the magnetic black sand. And the beach was covered in seashells, which we unashamedly collected and rinsed off to bring home. Just one more thing to fit into my new suitcase that I just bought. We then paid a quick stop to the Huia lookout point to admire the view of the ocean, and then we pulled over at a picnic area for a spot of tea. It was not unusual on these day trips for these tour guides to just have a pot of coffee and a pot of hot water and tea supplies and scones and pastries in the back of the car so that we could pull over and have an afternoon tea on the road. It was one of the things I really loved about New Zealand, and definitely something I missed since I've come home. It's so quintessentially British. The final stop on our tour was the Karamatura Loop Walk. I hope I'm saying this right. There is a Maori story about two lovers who were forbidden from being together, so they ran away and hid behind the waterfall at the end of this trail until their families gave up looking for them and accepted their union. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to make it all the way to the waterfall, but it was a lovely place to take a short hike through New Zealand's native flora and giant ferns. It was the perfect ending to my New Zealand adventure. And that's it, folks. That was my adventure in Auckland and the end of my adventure in New Zealand. I covered a lot of ground in 3 weeks. I got to see a lot of really cool and unique places, experience the rich Maori culture, and fulfill my dream of visiting Middle Earth. There will definitely have to be a return to New Zealand trip. Some of the things I'll have to do when I come back include visiting the Waitangi Treaty Grounds north of Auckland, visiting the Coromandel Peninsula and Abel Tasman National Park, taking the Hairy Feet tour near Pio, the Dark Skies experience at Lake Tekepo, and other Lord of the Rings tours around Christchurch and Dunedin. But for now, it was sadly time for me to bid farewell to the beautiful and unique country of New Zealand and start my journey home.
But not before one last adventure, so stay tuned for that.
If you haven't already watched my other New Zealand videos, I'll include links to those down in the description. And please consider subscribing to my channel to check out my other trip report videos, and stay tuned for other trip report videos to come. Okay, bye now.